My family has a bunch of inside jokes. Funny stories we share over and over again. Stories that are so attached to us by those who saw us grow up that they are an intrinsic part of our identities. One of those stories is centered around how, when I was just learning to walk, my parents would take me for short walks in the park near our home. The park was small, about a block long, right? Pretty normal for a healthy young family to take a little walk in the park. Well, the problem was that this short walk wasn't very short. No, as my mom puts it, it would take forever to get through this tiny neighborhood park. Why? Well, because little toddler me would have to stop and hug every single tree in the park. Every single one. They really shouldn't have been surprised when I grew up to be a big ol' witchy pagan who kind of believes that they were compelled by a ceiba tree dedicated to Alegua, the Orisha of the crossroads, to go to Cuba in the span of 3 days.
Today, I can announce that the United States has agreed to formally reestablish diplomatic relations with the Republic of Cuba.
You know there's story going around about the CIA and they're trying to get, sending in the folks to get Castro.
Cuba maintains close relations with Russia and China, providing these actors with influence platforms to foment an anti-American
Florida State
agenda.
Court has ruled on the case regarding temporary custody of Elian Gonzalez.
You ought to have that. It's incredible. I don't believe this thing in the world could. I don't think they ought to seriously consider it, but I think you ought to know about it.
The progress that we mark today is yet another demonstration that we don't have to be imprisoned by the past. When something isn't working, we can and will change.
In our last episode, I spent a little bit of time talking about some of the social, political, and economic drivers of the Cuban Revolution. I also mentioned the relationship between the indigenous people in Cuba and African people who were enslaved on the island. I had the opportunity to learn more about this relationship on my second day in Havana. My second day started at sunrise. Making a small breakfast and tea in my Airbnb, I had a multi-hour tour set up to begin bright and early with Beyond Roots, a woman and Afro-Cuban run cultural center, shop, and hair salon in Old Havana. I had booked their Afro-Cuban Roots experience on Airbnb, wanting to hear about Cuba from those who are most central to its culture. Anything you think about Cuba, from its music, to its food, to its drums and mojitos, and yes, spirituality, comes from descendants of African slaves and indigenous people in Cuba. I was there, ostensibly, to support the Cuban people. I wanted to walk that talk. The tour started with meeting my tour guide at the Beyond Roots shop. From there, we were to go to Guanabacoa, a historically Afro-Cuban neighborhood just outside of main Havana, and to the house of a babalao. The tour included the tour of a home, which also serves as a temple for the community, homemade lunch by the mother of the house, and a meeting with the babalao for a history and spiritual lesson about Regla de Ocha, more commonly known as Santeria. I don't expect you to believe in me or my spiritual practice. I share this story because of the meaning and perspective it provides to me. Now, I am pretty familiar already with Santeria at this point. My grandparents, and my dad, in fact, have had a relationship with a babalao in Miami. My grandmother has a shrine to the Orisha of the ocean, Yemaya, in her bedroom. None of us are initiated, mind you. All of us are lay people. Santeria is not a completely closed religion. Lay people are expected to know about and can participate in public rituals and have some level of relationship with Orisha. It is the whole, claiming to be headed by an Orisha or leading rituals and participating in some rituals. You need to go through a lineage and initiation for that. Like many ATR, African traditional religion, in Santeria, the Orisha are often syncretized with Catholic saints. This, similarly to Vodun in Haiti, in Candomblé in Brazil, helped to maintain traditional African spiritualities in the midst of intense Christian conversion in the New World. I am well aware of the prevalence of cultural appropriation in New Age religions, including neo-paganism. So my engagements with the Orisha and my own spiritual practice is from that perspective. I'm not headed by any Orisha. I'm not initiated. However, I do walk in spiritual circles of those who are initiated. You see, a year before this trip, October 2021, I was in a ritual where someone I know, who was headed by the Orisha Elegua, spoke to me. I even have the physical notes I wrote the message in. "You will find a way to go to Cuba," he said. "Find a tree standing on a rock." Pretty straightforward, but still vague message, right? In fact, this wasn't the first or only time this particular representative for Elegua told me that I needed to get to Cuba. The tree and the rock thing was more specific, though. I had planned to find a park. There were a bunch in Havana, where big, many-rooted ceiba trees grow to give my offerings and thanks to the land and the spirits that resided there. In fact, my Beyond Roots guide, Allison, told me that the sacred nature of the ceiba tree and cleansing with tobacco was shared with African people by Taino spiritual leaders when they built their community together in Guanabacoa. Regla de la Ocha is not just African in origin, but also indigenous. I loved Allison, by the way. A totally lovely person with such good energy. She is still working with Beyond Roots, so if you plan to travel to Cuba, please look her and look up Beyond Roots. So, when I arrived at Beyond Roots, I was told only one other person was going to be on the tour with me, a woman named Erin, also from the United States. Erin was from California, and we got acquainted and started chatting on the balcony overlooking the street below as we waited for our driver to arrive. It didn't take long for us to find out something very special. She is Afro-Cuban on her dad's side, and we were both the first to return to Cuba since the revolution. When we realized that, we both started crying, and then when Allison realized that, she started crying too. So here we are, just a bunch of stereotypical emotional Cubans bawling at the very real significance and confluence of events that seem destined for generational healing. What a way to start a very spiritual day. We three were driven to the Babalao's house in a Soviet-era car. Our driver, a hilarious man, made many jokes about his car, such as the Russian seatbelts, which are, of course, non-existent. He was a good driver, though, and we got to Guanabacoa safely. The house was right across the street from an abandoned women's prison. You could still see the bullet holes left over from the revolution. Allison continued to point out the significance of the neighborhood and its history as she led us through the gates to the main yard around the back of the house, where an open courtyard and a little pool of turtles, symbols of stability and strength in the home, greeted us. That's where I saw it, towering high with the late morning sun filtering through the leaves. A ceiba tree. I immediately walked over, drawn to it. It sat on a throne of concrete, of solid rock, broken up between its huge roots. A grate was nestled in its center, for offerings, Allison told us. I held back another rush of tears when Allison told me who the tree was dedicated to. I could almost hear the trickster's laugh ringing through my head. I'll let you take a guess whose it was. Once I calmed my own euphoria at realizing that this trip may have well been blessed by the gods, we were escorted to the kitchen where we were greeted by the mother of the house. She offered us coffee, and now I don't drink coffee, unless it is Cuban cafecito or cordadito and offered by a Cuban. So, of course, I accepted, and we sat at the table as she bustled around the kitchen. Allison helped translate, since I was not totally fluent, and Erin did not speak much Spanish either, let alone the colloquial Yoruba-tinged patois common to the neighborhood. We still laughed and ate delicious rice and beans and plantains, and Allison told us a little bit more about modern Cuba. I told her I noticed that a lot of people in Havana were wearing white clothing, the kind of clothing those who were going through initiation wore. The conversation took a more serious turn then, when she talked about the struggle to maintain the culture in the face of basically financial catastrophe and the massive exodus of young Cubans that was taking place. Like the relationship between Cuba and tourism, The temple was largely sustained by foreign initiates, but during COVID, important initiation and rituals were not able to take place. The pandemic saw massive struggle take place in Cuba. I'll talk more about that in the next episode. At the time, in 2022, people were finally about to take their spiritual journey to Cuba to be initiated. Many of the foreign santeros and santeras brought with them huge suitcases full of clothes, toiletries, and food to help support their Cuban spiritual communities. Allison told us that a few weeks prior, one of the initiates brought an entire rolling cooler full of meat to them. Aaron and I asked what we as Americans can do when we return to the States. Allison's answer was very simple. Tell people to come, to see Cuba for themselves. After we ate, we were escorted to the main room of the house, which was decorated with altars to the many orisha, with the child face Elegua at the center, of course. The Babalao met us there. He was pretty busy. It was a festival week, and there were ongoing rituals. We saw a few other congregants coming in and out of the house. Because he too spoke a mix of Spanish and Yoruba, Allison translated for us. He gave us a lesson on the basics of Regla de la Ocha, and introduced us to all of the Orisha's altars, and then led us in a short cleansing ritual. We were permitted to record. Here is me, or at least the audio of me, being cleansed. Both Aaron and I had also elected to have an ifa, a divinatory reading by the Babalao. I will not share the insights here, as they were highly personal, but I will say that they ended up being rather painfully accurate. Don't ask the gods for advice if you are not ready to hear the truth. After the cleansing and the divination, we were escorted out, where we were greeted by ritual drummers. We did quite a bit of dancing and drinking then, alongside some of the other members of the community who were there for other rituals during the day. I did a bit of a deep dive on Cuban drums after this trip. It's pretty interesting. The drums used in ritual have their own spirit that inhabits the drum. Men are exclusively allowed to drum in Regla de la Ocha, though there are a few women who are trying to work around this prohibition. It's kind of controversial, but any drumming session always opens with a prayer to Elegua. He is the first of any orisha called, as he is the road opener. to the drums and drank a special mix of rum that is meant for ritual purposes. And then finally, the babalao came to gift us a thread of white beads, a collar, dedicated to Olodumare, the creator of the universe, in Regla de la Ocha. It is simple to say that this was a beautiful and deeply meaningful experience for me. When I was dropped off back at Old Havana, I spent the rest of the afternoon and early evening walking around, just to get myself acquainted with the area for the rest of the week. Could say it was kind of in a daze, but it was a little more contemplative than that. As I walked the streets of Havana, I thought about the impact of Black culture on what is my own ancestry. Like I said, the descendants of African slaves are responsible for so much of Cuban culture, from music to spirituality. And it's a bit of an urban legend, but many people believe that the reason Fidel Castro survived the CIA's many assassination attempts was because he himself was initiated and headed, and therefore protected, by El Egua. This mix of politics, rebellion, race, and spirituality is not unknown in the New World. Haiti is famous and demonized for its slave rebellions and revolution being driven by those who practice Vodun. Post-revolution, the Cuban government provided verbal and armed support in the fight for independence across the African continent. There is much to be criticized regarding Che Guevara's own thinly veiled racism during this time, but Cuba at least did the bare minimum in opposing apartheid, compared to, the US of A.
In 1991, Nelson Mandela visited Cuba with then President Fidel Castro. This is a clip when they first met.
Before we say anything,
Antes de hablar absolutamente de cualquier tema,
you must tell me when you are coming to South
me
Africa.
tiene que decir cuándo viene para Sudáfrica.
You see, no,
No, un momentito. The sooner the better.
And we have had a visit from a wide
Y nos ha
variety of
invitado una
people.
gran cantidad de personas.
And our friend Cuba,
Y nuestro amigo Cuba,
which helped us in training our people,
que nos ayudó a entrenar a nuestra gente,
gave us resources to
que nos
get
dio
on with our
recursos,
struggle,
que nos ayudaron tanto en nuestra
trained
lucha,
our people
que
as
entrenó a nuestros
doctors and so
combatientes, a
on.
nuestros médicos.
You have not come to our country.
Cuba no ha venido a visitarnos, usted no ha ido a visitar.
When are you coming?
¿Cuándo viene?
No he visitado a mi patria
I
surafricana.
haven't visited my South African homeland
La
yet.
quiero como una patria.
I love it as a
Quiero por él
homeland.
y por el pueblo.
I love it as a homeland as I love you and the South African
When are
people.
you
Cuba also supported the civil rights movement in the United States. There is an entire Wikipedia article dedicated to a list of Black civil rights leaders, Black Panthers, and Black Power movement leaders who sought shelter in Cuba to escape persecution at home. Huey Newton and Assata Shakur are two very famous names on that list.
Shakur portrayed herself as a fighter for racial justice by what she called armed struggle if necessary.
People have the right to free themselves from oppression by whatever means they deem possible.
In the campaign to save Assata's life for all of those decades.
In this Women's History Month special, we continue our conversation with Angela Davis.
And now, of course, as there are new openings with respect to Cuba, we welcome the end of the embargo, the blockade. But at the same time, we have to be attentive to what this might mean for Assata.
The story I'm about to tell you is how I, Huey P. Newton, the Black Panther Party founder, was set free into a prison.
I didn't know I was having company.
All right, listen up. We're gonna get Huey to Cuba in the next 48 hours.
And what we do is we make it look like it's one of your movies.
It's a location shoot as far as the feds are concerned. We got hair, makeup, wardrobe. What movie are we talking about? The Big Cigar. I mean, I love The Big Cigar, man.
Now, we can't talk about racial justice movements without talking about the Red Scare and the Cold War. We can touch on some of those issues throughout this series, but I think I need to make this clear. Every scholar of human rights movements has to contend with the primary reason for resistance to their calls for justice. And that normally boils down to money and power. The fight between capitalism and communism, the US and Russia, was often capitalized on during the mid-20th century to squash human rights protests across the board. Labor unionist? Communist. Feminist? Communist. Voting rights? Communist. Queer? Communist. This isn't to say that the so-called communist governments did not attempt the same thing on their side. They did. In many horrifying ways, they did. However, my responsibility is to my society, my culture, my politicians, and my history. So I'll say it. Do I think the US backlash against Cuba and the Cuban Revolution was partially driven by racism? Yes. You can't uncouple a legacy of slavery and genocide compounded by an economic embargo and not realize that they are driven by the same factors that drive the forces of our particular favor of racism: money and power. After all that, what is it that the descendants of this complicated relationship, people like Allison, told me to tell you? Oh yeah. Go to Cuba. See it for yourself. In our next episode, we are going to dive deeper into the other side, a sociologist's perspective and street-level view of the impact of the Cuban government on the Cuban people, and why 2 + 2 = 5. Stay tuned. Thank you for listening to the 5th episode of Once Upon a Time in Havana. This is Lisa Alvarez here, just to remind you that you can find out more about our upcoming Havana Syndrome, the spy thriller, on our website. You can join our email newsletter. You can also follow us on social media. And quick reminder, I'm about to head out to my artist residency at Crosstown Arts. I've been so grateful for all the support that I've been receiving. And if you'd like to contribute to the Artist Fund, you can find that on our website, HavanaSyndromePodcast.com or Havana-Syndrome.net. I would really appreciate any additional help as I, get groceries and feed myself while I work on this massively ambitious new project. Thank you again for listening. I really appreciate all the wonderful reviews and comments about this series. Obviously, it is very personal to me, and it's very meaningful to take you along the ride with me. We'll see you next week. As always, stay magical.